Evening, everyone. I'm Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual vASN, Political Science Professor at Queen's University, Canada. And I'm here to welcome everyone and to thank the panel of experts for agreeing to share their expertise with us on this very important subject, the topic of nationalism and climate change, which had not been prominently featured in the literature on nationalism for a very long time. There are some exciting new publications on it, and I would like to thank Professor Peter Rutland, who suggested that we do a virtual vASN webinar on this topic, a conversation that he is going to moderate. And I'm going to introduce only Peter Rutland, our expert moderator, who is also Vice President of vASN, of the Association for the Study of Nationalities, and also one of the core members of Virtual vASN, our designer and planning team. And I'm really thankful to Peter for organizing several of these really exciting, important conversations on Virtual vASN on big subjects. We've done several of these in the past on large questions on nationalism and race, nationalism and the pandemic, and others that have addressed issues that had not really been part of the bread and butter of nationalism studies that we teach in our nationalism classes. And I'm hoping that by introducing them, featuring them on our platform, Virtual vASN, we are doing something also to bring them more into the mainstream, because these are hugely significant issues. And so I'm going to give the virtual floor over to Peter Rutland. And thank you, everyone on the panel, and I look forward to an exciting conversation.
Okay, well, thank you, Zsuzsa, and welcome everybody. Not be more urgent and more pressing with the re-election of Donald Trump, and with the COP29 summit taking place in Baku right now. This topic is front page news and of tremendous importance to humanity. And we have three very interesting scholars to get the discussion going today. Each presenter will talk initially for just 10 minutes, and that will leave us good time for discussion. And the audience is encouraged to post questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom website. The chat function is going to be used by the organizers to post presenters. So given that the links will be there, I'll keep the introductions brief. Daniele Conversi is a professor at the University of the Basque Country. He's an authority on precisely this question of nationalism and climate change, and had a very interesting article in Nationalities Papers 3 years ago. Marianna Poberezhskaya is a associate professor at Nottingham, Trent University. She herself, she recently told us, is a member of the Jordanian delegation to the COP29 in Baku. She'll be headed to Baku in a couple of days' time, so that's very exciting for her. And then we have Rosa Navarrete, who is a PhD from Mannheim. She's a lecturer in European integration at the Saartland University. So we will start off with Professor Conversi, who will give us a kind of typology of approaches to nationalism and climate change.
Thank you very much, Peter. I am now trying to share my presentation. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, it's going on. Fine, fantastic. Okay, so I will be the first one to talk about that, and I'm going to raise a few questions about our future, our future, and I hope I can offer a new lens through which you can see things more clearly. But I warn you, what you're going to see might not please you. introduction, in order to do this, I have to I decided to divide the presentation in 3 parts. The first part is about the awareness, the necessary awareness on our parts of scientific research and discoveries, which are very important and evolving very, very rapidly, with new data coming every day. Awareness, second point, is awareness of the general disruptive potential of nationalism, especially in this historical moment. And third, awareness, which is my task here, of new types of nationalism emerging as a response to the climate crisis. So on the basis of these 3, I will start with science. As you know, there is a lot of research talking about the fact that we are very near to tipping points leading to irreversible change. Think about 1.5 degrees. If this is reached, it's not going back for thousands of years, and nobody will ever experience spring, summer, and fall and winter in the same way our children and us have experienced. It's a change forever. There is a world of brink on disaster. There is a lot of different things, but we have known this for about 15 years, and we also know that mass consumption is the main product of this, the main cause of this, particularly fossil fuel consumption, which has been widely disregarded. At this point, there are millions of research articles which have been published, and the initial problem in science has been that it has been completely unable to transcend their disciplinary boundaries. There is a difficulty of communicating the current crisis. This difficulty arose in part from science itself, from scientific research. The problem of monodisciplinarity is probably the hardest problem in this historical moment. I think it's a question of methodology and at the same time of ethos and morality. We cannot afford to be monodisciplinary anymore. It's highly dangerous. There is an enormous lack in research part in the social science as a consequence of this. Yet there is a new trend which is going towards a new direction, incorporating science. And there are, of course, several scholars, I will couple and mention them, but it is in the earth science which this happens first, perhaps first, and which more important results. The earth science has produced very important discoveries by combining science across the spectrum. Scientists now reach 100% consensus of not just on global warming, on the anthropogenic cause of global warming. And what is also, there is the notion of planetary boundaries, which if you want, I can explore later, which leads to us to think in terms of overconsumption, not only fossil fuel consumption, as a major problem affecting the planet and putting our life at risk. And when I say our life, I think about our children, which might not be able to see any bright future as a consequence of this. Historical work has been done back to the 1950s. There has been a research, a lot of data has been accumulated from the 1950s to the 2020 when this article was published. I urge everybody to read this article, Extraordinary Human Energy Consumption, which try to identify the beginning of what is called the Anthropocene. It was actually this book by an historian John McNeill, who is called The Great Acceleration, which created a watershed understanding. We help us to understand how everything is related to mass consumption. Synthesizing with this first part, first, scientific research is rapidly advancing, but doesn't bring good news, like the science of the past, something which we wouldn't like to hear. Then we need to constantly update knowledge. Therefore, we need transdisciplinarity more than interdisciplinarity. We need to work in teams of scientists, like earth scientists, who work across discipline. And we have to ask which are the obstacles as political scientists. And that's where the bulk of my paper comes. I think my presentation is based on the fact that nationalism is founded on a distinction between us and them. And this is a residual problem because it's becoming a major obstacle. I published a book in Italian in 2022 on this approach. And nationalism is an ideology based on the construction of maintenance of boundaries. I argue that in 1995 and in 1999, with an article published in Millennium, the latest one. The problem is that climate change is uncontainable, so it cannot be addressed within national, class, ethnic, gender, or geographical boundaries. But at the same time, can we ignore nationalism? The main organizing principle of the modern nation state is nationalism. Can we pretend it doesn't exist? I would say it's quite impossible. At the same time, we need to understand, as I said, both its limits and its possibilities. But the problem is nationalist studies, which is a discipline which should be at the forefront of this, is very late, is catching up later than any other branch of the social science. The first systematic article in the field was published, as Peter said, in here in the Nationality Papers. It was my paper in the Ultimate Challenge, which is now over 150 quotations. In the same year, Anatole Livin published the first book on climate change in the nation state from an IR perspective. And then from this point on, a new trend of research has developed. There are three types of nationalism which I address here. The first two types are in the article. So I encourage you to read the article because it talks about resource nationalism and the other one, which is green nationalism. Resource nationalist control is really an obsession with national resources above all other interests, whether they are fossil fuels or lithium, in the case of Bolivia. But generally, you couldn't even imagine the invasion of Ukraine if Russia wouldn't be redefined as an energy superpower. This is from Peter Rutland, who very clearly mentioned that before. Very early. I hope resource nationalism will be dealt by Marianna in the next paper, and the green nationalism will be touched upon, I hope, by Rosa. A short definition here: a type of nationalism that can tackle the climate emergency, channeling the nation's energies towards a common goal, common to all humanity. But the form is we have to identify, and I write another article with Mark Howe on defining green nationalists through the experience of Scotland and Catalonia, and of course other stateless nations. This has been brought up then again by Rosa and other scholars. And then the first one, which is the most scary one, fossil fascists. This is the third type. We are still working on that. I say we because we are a group of researchers working on climate obstruction, and you might know about the CSSN. And I am leading a group which is one of the working group. And now one of the tasks here is to try to identify what fossil fascism is. I define it as a political system centered on the active defense of fossil fuels, extraction, while silencing, suppressing public opposition to it. It works under an ethno-racial nationalist agenda. We don't know whether it's normally far right. To the point that if climate is a global war, they are launching their people into mass deaths. But it can be affect a neoliberal spectrum as well. In Australia, in Spain, in Italy, it affects people from the moderate, conservative, neoconservative right as well. And of course, in the UK, many people have been imprisoned for nothing, for under very protective accusation, and probably is a place where if you are a climate activist, you should be more careful. This is also being investigated at the moment by several scholars. This movement is a product of international political wars, in which the fossil fuel interests, okay, Peter is climbing. It's sometimes referred wrongly as ecofascism, but as I say in this article, ecofascism is an oxymoron because there is no connection with fascism historically. So it's just a name stuck there, which is, and I think the author of this book, Moore and Roberts, discussed very deeply what ecofascism could mean and whether they should drop it altogether. At the end, they probably have accepted it for some reason. But the problem, the notion of fossil fascism comes from Andreas Malm and the Zetkin Collective, which is coming from, in terms from Roger's Griffin idea of fascism as an ideological movement aiming at the rebirth of the nation and aspiring to recover the glory of a golden age. So it's palingenetic. Palingenesis is rebirth. Eric Hobson also said that nationalists, especially ultranationalists, emerge in times of existential threat. Anthony Smith also says slightly different, say that golden age is common to most nationalists. But denial, repression, and lawfare as its characteristic. Now, in the global north, you have the UK case and a few other countries, but in the global south, the situation is worse. It's not simply they are jailed, they are killed, disappeared, hidden, abducted, outlawed, imprisoned. You should absolutely read the Global Witness Yearly Report, 2023, and you could see there whether there is how much nationalism is present in this case. Sometimes it's not at all, I must say, but it is their case for saying that nationalism pejorates this situation. So in conclusion, I just say at the beginning, as I mentioned, that we find ourselves in a unique moment of history when human and non-human survival can be decided by very few individuals in a very short time. It is no longer a question of if, but of when and how. And also stressed that interdisciplinarity is, since the longer the delay, the less people may become able to do anything, the prospect of hostile fascism is unfortunately gaining grounds every day more. So there are a lot of other things which we need to discuss here, but to come into the conclusion, I think that the first thing is working across disciplines. So one of the major boundaries between us is precisely the boundaries, disciplinary boundaries. This is very difficult to do, but it must be done. The second thing, we have to find a kind of dimension which is which it means to tackle the different kinds of nationalism, and only after this we can perhaps work towards a better understanding of what is going on. And I encourage all people working in nationalism of including at least some mention of climate change in their article. And having said that, I think I've thank you again the invitation, and here is my conclusion.
Thank you, Daniele. Indeed, a very grim picture, a lot of new angles to think about, most of them quite depressing. But we will move on to Marianna Poberezhskaya for her presentation.
Okay, I will also share my presentation. Hopefully it's all working now, as it should. Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this fascinating talk discussion. In the next 10 minutes, I just want to highlight some of the findings from a number of different research projects, but that all kind of work with the same common theme of exploring how climate change state narratives, where we're talking about official narratives or public narratives, how do they differ, if they do, in the non-democracies or authoritarian regimes? And over the number of years, I've been involved in a number of the projects, different countries that manifest themselves different degrees of authoritarianism, starting with Russia, then Central Asia, and more recently engaged with the countries in the Middle East, and particularly the smaller country, resourceful country, Jordan. And what I was able to observe in this research through this research endeavors is that whilst we were dealing with very different geographical, cultural, historical, and so on context, but there were clear similarities. And one of the questions been asking is that whether these similarities in climate change policies could be explained by the overarching impact of authoritarianism or restrictive regimes, non-democratic regimes. And if so, how can we say, what can we say how these authoritarian regimes impact those climate narratives, climate discussions in the countries? And some of the kind of basic ideas to start with this thought progression is that when we look at authoritarian countries, of course, it's important to understand what is the basis of the regime survival. Is the number one goal for authoritarianism is ensure this, unstoppable regime survival. And it comes to climate change, and there are quite interesting arguments here that can be observed. On one side, climate change-related policies could be seen as a threat, existential threat, to the survival of the regime in the so-called petrostates, where the economic stability depends on the export of the fossil fuels. At the same time, we can also see climate change itself as a threat to the actual existence of the countries, and particularly resource-scarce countries that cannot adapt adequately to the climate change negative consequences. And in some particular cases, we can see both, like in the Gulf, where their economic stability, economic foundation is threatened by the climate change policies, but also the actual survival of the state is threatened by the climate change due to the rapidly rising temperatures in the region. Also, what is interesting as we're looking at the different examples of the authoritarian regimes, even though there is definitely the significant impact of political regime over the climate policies, but you cannot automatically predict which way it's going to go. In simple terms, you cannot say that if it's an authoritarian country, then they definitely will be climate skeptical or climate denialist. They might actually at some point benefit from quite proactive climate policies because it ensures, it brings some kind of benefits to the governing regime. And just a few examples from the case studies. For instance, in the Russian case, we've seen these manifestations of the so-called replacements of the discourses, where nature and national become the same thing. If we're talking about national territories, national resources, national parks here instead of nature parks. And also we see personalization of the discourses, where the achievements in any kind of achievements, even though artificial ones, they prescribe to the state leaders and become the matter of pride, of national pride. And then we see very paradoxical situations where the country, like Russia, is still one of the largest greenhouse gas emitters in the world, is presented as environmental leader, as environmental donor, as a savior, and especially big emphasis around the Russian vast forest reserves. And behind that, we forget about the fossil fuel export and the whole structure of the economy of the country. And also in some more extreme circumstances, we can see how climate politics completely being replaced with just politics. So they become the victims of any other seemingly more significant political processes in the countries. For instance, even before the invasion, the climate change, the key figures in the climate change politics in the countries were saying that sanctions regime is incompatible with the proactive climate policies, and Russia cannot now contribute to the global efforts on climate change mitigation policies because of the Western sanctions. Since the invasion, we see even more interesting discussions of how climate change discourse has been impacted by a geopolitical shift, or how now we need to talk about the non-Western climate alliances and how these non-Western powers need to take control of the global climate narratives. Very briefly, from other case studies, actually in the examples of the Kazakhstan and the Jordan, we observed a very interesting situation where the climate change itself could be seen as a resource. And Daniele has mentioned the concept of the resource nationalism. In our study in Kazakhstan, we kind of expand this idea, seeing how climate change carbon emissions, how they become a resource that regime is able to sell or to trade with the West in order to either bring investments or bring some other political benefits. For instance, to sell this idea of Kazakhstan being a reliable international partner, as being a regional leader. And of course, again, I see quite a high degree of personalization of climate politics. Nazarbayev was very proud of his kind of this modernist agenda and using environmental discourse to his benefit and to raise his profile. Tokayev is less so, but still very proud of his UN credentials, a former background, professional experience, and is quite articulate in the international context and international dialogue. Jordan here is a very interesting case because in this example, climate change vulnerability becomes a resource, and a resource which is worthy of renting out. Jordan, just to give you a very brief background, is a rather stable country within an extremely unstable region, and it has been traditionally a very important recipient of the refugees coming from the surrounding, conflict areas. And they're very good at connecting those issues of their quite high climate change vulnerability and their geopolitical significance. And therefore, combining those two issues, climate change then becomes a resource that they can also exploit in order to bring international investments and the support coming from the West, from the international community. This is all very interesting and could be seen in quite positive terms. But we have to go back to what I mentioned at the start, that we're dealing here with non-democracies, with authoritarian countries. So even when we see seemingly positive developments in climate change discourses as policies, we still have to be very cautious because we still have dealing with rather artificial approach to climate change mitigation and adaptation policy. So what happens when the regime is no longer interested in this resource? What happens if they find the other other resource to rent, other source of income, other opportunity, other way to stabilize themselves? For instance, Jordan also very closely working with Gulf and is very keen on supporting Gulf countries in the climate change negotiations. Then it becomes apparent that we are lacking consistently a genuine, sustainable climate change agenda. And just to conclude, so we do see that how in non-democracies and authoritarian states, these manifestations of overarching, political context and the way it shapes climate change policies. And whilst we do see some examples where this stagnates climate agenda, there are also situations we have to admit that sometimes authoritarian regimes are quite efficient in pushing forward climate change agenda and being very practical, very pragmatic in the way they advance their climate change position. But yes, at the end, the main point here is that we have to remain cautious. We have to still realize that we're talking about resource nationalism, rentirism, and we're talking about the climate change policies that remain outside of these deliberate democratic processes, and therefore they still remain rather vulnerable. I'll finish here.
Great, thank you, Marianna. Well, there was some sprouts of optimism in your presentation, at least compared to Daniele's, in terms of your very innovative reframing of resource nationalism to include things like carbon emission ability as a resource which countries can use for investment and diplomatic recognition. So I thought that was very, very fruitful approach. So we'll go now to Rosa Navarrete, who is going to look at the European and democracies.
Okay, so I think you can see my screen now. Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation. I will go into the European context. I will focus more on how parties move from politicizing a salient issue or salience issue and becoming making this issue what we call positional issue. So environment and climate are issues that traditionally were just defended by Green parties, and the way in which they were making these more prominent in the political debate was by by making them more salient in the discussion. But in the last years, we see that there is like a counter movement that it's creating some opposition. So there are parties that are positioning against the protection of the environment, against measures to protect, to mitigate global warming and climate change. And I wanted to know what is this happening and why I want to know this. Well, I don't know if you can, it's not moving, sorry. Yeah, now, so these images are from the last floods in Valencia, in Spain. So Valencia is a region of Spain that is in the east, and it's one of the regions that is much more threatened by climate change. So it's not only the problem with floods that we experiment lastly 2 weeks ago, and even today there was again this threat, but it's also threatened by climate hazards like extreme heat waves. So this was just a tragedy produced by climate change, but in the end it became something that created some political controversy because of the what was preceding this and what happened afterwards. So just to show you some images of the devastation and the relevance of paying attention to climate change, because it gives us a good perspective of how this is affecting people from different ideologies. And it's, as we are talking sometimes about transversal issues, so this is clearly something that affects people from different social classes and backgrounds. However, what we can see is that there are parties that are using this to compete in the electoral arena. So just to show you, this is Valencia before the flooding, and you see that there are some densely populated neighborhoods, and these populated neighborhoods were the result of savage urbanization and a model, an economic model that is very linked to this idea of neoliberalism. And these were areas that were, even before the extreme situation in which we are now, they were threatened by the possibility of suffering flooding. This is the result of what happened after these floods. So why I am saying that this had some implications, not just before for this idea of savage urbanization and building housing in areas that are not good for that. It is because the first thing that the regional government did, the new regional government did, was precisely eliminate one of these emergency response units that was created by the previous government. So the regional government, the current regional government that includes Vox and PP, it's a conservative and radical right party in the Valencian community. And the first decision was to dismantle the creation of this Valencian Emergency Response Unit that was approved by the progressive government that left the office. And the purpose or the goal of this emergency response unit was to be prepared in cases such as these floods that they are suffering, because, as I said, Valencia is one of the areas that are more threatened by climate change. We have also some evidence, because you could see, well, why they did it. They were even proud of this. So it was, as I said, the first decision, and they framed this in a context of being efficient with how they spend public money. But this is kind of controversial if we compare these decisions with this other one. So at the same time that they were cutting budget on a unit that was aimed to prevent the effects of this kind of devastation created by climate hazards, they increase the budget of something that is very stereotypical, and it's bullfighting in Spain. So the idea is that, well, now we see that there are parties that use climate as a way to, as a reaction against progress, or as a way to maintain this idea of traditional order. They react against all the measures to prevent climate change. And I wanted to show you also something that is very telling. So this is one of the posters of one of the events that was created to collect funds for the people in Valencia. So you see this contrast, and in the end, this was a poster for an event that has to be canceled because, of course, it created a lot of disappointment in the people, because it was kind of a mock to what was happening with the way everything was managed. So what was relevant for me and why I study climate change, and I moved from the politicization of some issues and left-right into the politicization of climate change, is that the more evident the effects of climate change, the more opposition we observe against climate action. And I wanted to show you some other examples. This is again from Spain. So you can see on one side, this was a bike lane that is being removed, even though it was very costly, and they had to return some money to the European Commission that was funding these the creation of these bike lanes in Valladolid. These were dismantled by, for ideological reasons. And the other picture is Puerta del Sol, which is one of the most famous squares in Spain. It is based in Madrid. And you can see that, it was renovated recently, and there is not a single tree. And you can imagine how this is in the summer with 40 degrees and not a single tree to save you from this crazy sun. But there are even more examples of this, and one is from the case of Valencia. Again, we were talking about an area in which climate change was a real threat, and we see that one of the regional minister of tourism, so the equivalent, when she was asked about, climate change is threatening Valencia, what are you thinking about it? They were saying like, well, it's good because if there is a global warming, so they still connect this idea of global warming, there will be more tourism in the area. So we see this counter reaction against climate protection. So as I said, environmental protection has moved from being a salient issue to a positional issue, and parties' positions against climate action or environmental protection are a symbolic way to defend the preservation of traditional structures or traditional order. I wanted to show you also some positive examples of nationalism, and it's connected to what Daniele said in his intervention before, when he was talking about green nationalism. So in a paper together with Joan Enguer, we studied the case of Catalonia, and we can see that in those cases, we talk about regional parties, but would be like Catalan nationalistic parties have a position in which they are more pro-climate or more in favor of climate protection than those parties that compete at the national level. But we also see that the more the more they defend this center-periphery divide, the more likely they are, or the more pro-peripheral they are, the more likely they are to defend climate policies. We see another example of how parties are positioning to confront, in this case of green nationalism, was to confront with the center, but we have an example here of how parties use climate and environmental policies to confront with the status quo right now. This is from the European Union, and you can see here we were studying manifestos, and it shows that Eurosceptic parties are challenging the European Union by adopting negative positions on what these were traditional issues. I wanted to move also to the idea of national identities and briefly talk about the case of Germany, given that I am based in Germany. So what about the Germans? So the German Green Party was the most important party among the Greens in Europe. We see that they were very successful in the last elections, and there is something that you do not see in other countries. So in the case of Germany, for example, this is the Germany recycling system, and they are very proud of this. It's part of their identity as much as the Lederhosen. And of course, all parties, you can see that parties on the left and on the right, they are much more greener than parties in other countries. However, we'd have to understand what is the context. So in the last elections, as you know, we will have elections again in Germany in February. In the last elections, we also had floods here in Germany. And the candidate from the CDU, which was supposed to be the next Chancellor Laschet, was caught laughing with others in the middle of the tragedy. And as a reaction, we see that the Greens really have a tremendous success of it. What is the situation here in Germany? I want to end with some optimism after what I told of this backlash against climate protection. And we see that, for example, in the case of Germany, this is from a survey that I ran together with some colleagues. We see that those who consider that they are not at all responsible for protecting the environment are just about a third, which is still a lot, but it's not still it's not half of the country. And then you see that in the case of Germany, concern over climate change is very high. So almost 50% of the population is very worried about climate change. We see that more than a third are somewhat worried, and those who are not worried at all are 17%, which it's more or less the percentage of people that is expected to vote for AfD. So I just wanted to move very quickly and again give some hints of optimism. And I wanted to say that this was the result of an experiment that we did with some participants, and in which we were presenting them with different combinations of parties that usually do not show, I mean, we know that parties usually show a coherent structure, but in this case, they were presented with parties with non-coherent structures in which they could defend an authoritarian regime and be pro-immigration and at the same time pro-environment. And so it was with different combinations, 3,000 participants. And in the end, we find that in the case of Germany, the environment is still one of the biggest predictors of vote. So citizens want to vote for parties that are defending the environment. This was everything quickly. I don't know if I adjusted to the 10 minutes, but I am looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Rosa, for a very rich presentation and your approach of showing how some parties can position themselves and gain votes by opposing climate change. I think that directly addresses one of the first questions that we had in the Q&A, which was a question about the implications of the election of Donald Trump, because it seems to me that the part of the Trump appeal, the drill baby drill appeal to fossil fuel development, is precisely in the American context what you're describing, of positioning a party to appeal to people on the basis of kind of confronting climate change and denying it that it's a problem, and addressing people's anxieties about climate change by assuring them that we can pump more oil and gas. And that seems to work in terms of getting some votes into the Trump camp. Yes, Daniele has rejoined us. So let's start off maybe with that question of, as scholars, what comments would you have based on your own research on the election of Donald Trump and what it means for the future of America global struggle to mitigate climate change. Does anybody want to tackle that question?
So if I may.
Sure.
Okay, so I wanted to mention the research by Jale Tosun from the University of Heidelberg. She was studying the number of policies to mitigate climate, and she found out that even during the first 4 years of Trump, there were some advance in climate protection regarding the number of policies, and also we see that carbon emissions were also going down. In this situation, I think that it's going to be very difficult because it's much more extreme. And based on the people that is surrounding him now and those who are being elected to be part of his government, I think that we cannot expect much from the national government. Maybe we see some regulation at the state level. So I'm very pessimistic about it, about the role of the United States. I think that the only opportunity is advancement on the efficiency of technology. That maybe we find that technology is it's improving in how they consume energy, and this could maybe help. But I am not positive about the situation in the United States, even though we see that during the first 4 years of Donald Trump, there was some still not as in the past, but there were some laws to protect the environment and prevent climate change.
Mm-hmm. I would add that one interesting development in the last couple of weeks was public statements by the leaders of Exxon and Chevron urging Trump to stay in the Paris Accord, not to pull out as he did in his first administration. And secondly, they're also arguing for the preservation of carbon reduction measures through the Green New Deal, because they've already invested billions of dollars in these new technologies. And as corporations, they want to be part of that new market, and they want stability in relations with the government. And so we may rely on the oil and gas lobby to be the main lobbyist for sensible climate change policies under Donald Trump. And even in the Biden administration, 80% of the funding for carbon reduction activities and renewables went to Republican districts, because the big centers of oil and gas production, the big centers of wind and solar are Texas and Oklahoma and so on. So it's only the small companies, the frackers, who are very pro-Trump, not the oil majors. I don't know if Marianna or Daniele want to add anything.
I just wanted very briefly, also got this impression that the internal politics probably locked at the moment, and that Trump won't be able to shake them as much as he presents that he can. But from my point of view, it's very interesting the US impact at the international stage. And I know that this COP, even before, because all the delegations were preparing the agendas before the elections outcome was known, and heard from some technocrats, going into the COP, saying that they're very cautious, and everybody is looking at the US, what is going to happen with the elections. And now, as the COP is undergoing, one of the impressions that I'm receiving is that it's very slow and very quiet. Other countries are very careful. What are they committing? And I think this is probably the more destructive impact of the Trump administration, that they have this influence outside of the American borders. So we'll see what happens at the end of the COP, but at least that's a slow start.
Oh, that's exactly what I thought. I thought that the major impact of Trump administration would be international, would be actually disastrous, because it will encourage other countries to pull out or reduce their commitment to climate action. In the United States, of course, I have lost, I think it's no longer a model. Of course, you can also think in those terms, the United States is not is abandoning its leadership position with Trump. There will not be an American leadership of the huge changes which we are experiencing. So the world is on its own, let's say, and the same will happen in the United States themselves, where local initiatives, a lot of grassroots movements are springing up, and some are very effectively, not just in terms of energy, because that's also, we have to consider that also changing energy type is costly, and it is long good in terms of effect, but it is not just that. It's simply lifestyle, and a lot of people are changing their lifestyle, and I think this is more important. This is happening in USA and everywhere else. It doesn't depend on Trump, and we should think about these terms. And then I also, I'm not very confident in capitalism self-regulating itself, so I don't think it's we have an answer in that respect. So maybe the big fossil fuel company are really engaged in the transition, and they might not want Trump to obstacle what they invested on already. And the same would happen to Saudi Arabia, the same would happen to United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and so on, and other petro-states, which are somehow committed to some form of superficial, at least, green nationalism, which can be greenwashing if you want. And then there is, of course, China. China is actually the leading power in terms of green technologies, and biodiversity is also being saved in China. So it looks like simply to me that with Trump, the USA is no longer in a leading position. They are actually shooting in their foot, and we are no longer interested in USA, at least politically. So that might be one of the results of Trump elections. And of course, if we withdraw from the agreement, that would be the greatest, like shooting in the head rather than in their feet. And I don't know whether the Agenda 2050 will take advantage of Trump and will seize actually power by advising Trump's in policy, which he shouldn't be advised, at least not from that source.
Okay, thanks. And I would encourage the audience to post questions in the Q&A section on the website. And Daniele mentioned China, who is, of course, current source of carbon emissions, but also has moved more than any other industrial country to promote renewables, and their investments in solar and wind technology has led to an 80% cut in cost. And so if we'd had a bigger panel, we would have had a panelist talking about China as well. We can't cover everything in 1 hour, but I would ask Marianna to talk maybe a little bit about China in terms of your model of different responses of authoritarian regimes. How would China fit into your typology?
So China is a very interesting actor here. And I myself per se don't work in the country, but will be recently been familiarizing myself with some fascinating work by the colleagues who work in this area. And there's interesting discussion, like you said, absolutely. China is now positioning itself as this global leader in renewable energy and global leader in its at least commitments to the carbon neutrality and net zero and so on. And it definitely is the voice to listen to, which is equally still has power to interact with the West and with the other, non-Western actors. At the same time, we have this kind of controversial issues with China, that it is still the leading emitter in the world, and whether those emissions can be still justified by this ongoing discussion of historical justice on injustice. That's a very complicated issue, because for years we've been hearing from China and India that, you know, it's our time to catch up, and because you outsourced all your dirty, you know, industries, factories into our countries and so on. But it seems to be that this is argument becoming a bit dated, and China's emissions are still too big, too significant, and they're going too fast, and there's no longer justify, and they're now surpassing the historical, even if you look at it proportionately, the historical emissions of the West, which, you know, that took West to develop, to advance economically. So that argument becomes very, very difficult to push forward. But there is also another agenda, and maybe I'm taking the discussion now in a very different angle, obviously with the whole geopolitical situation happening in the, you know, in Eurasia, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw, you know, problems in Caucasus, but also the Middle East reigniting the conflicts again. We bring in also this security agenda into the climate change and sustainability narratives, where there is argument that renewable energy sources, they make country more secure from this point of view, because obviously, if you can see the way now the war is going between you know, Russia and Ukraine, they're obviously trying to destroy the infrastructures, the energy infrastructures, the power stations, and so on. So with renewable energy being more decentralized system, it's much more difficult to do this kind of thing. So there's now this big discussion and debate where there's another kind of justifications for countries based on their national ideas to move forwards towards relying more on the renewable energy sourcing rather than on fossil fuel sources.
Right. And the whole question, again, it's a whole dimension which we don't really have time or space to get into, of energy security as a factor in national policy, with China, you know, being so dependent on imported oil and gas now, and the vulnerability in the event of conflict of those supplies being interrupted. So that, and we've seen that happening with the Houthis firing missiles at tankers in the Red Sea, right? So this climate debate does directly map onto security debates, and usually this is just more bad news. It looks like it's just another set of problems which are very intractable interacting. Now, we did have a question about the role of science diplomacy and collaborative research, and that directly brings us back to Daniele's opening points about the importance of following the science, which is developing very rapidly, and political scientists have to do a better job at incorporating those insights into our analysis. So, Daniele, is that something which you...
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating. I think it's a difficult, because the university structure is organized in such a way that it always prizes monodisciplinarity. If you publish outside your journal, if you publish, I mean, at least in Europe, probably, I don't know, in the USA, but if you publish in a scientific journal, you're a sociologist, it doesn't count towards your evaluation, but it depends on the university. Generally, there is a tendency of reading the stuff in your field. So there must be something more active. I mean, we have to, there are already important networks of which I'm a member, which try exactly to do that, to bring the science into the hard science into social sciences. And this is a quite difficult task for many people. There is also the problem in nationalist studies, as nationalism, I wouldn't like to say, but it seems like to reflect the field. So then I wouldn't dare to say, I wouldn't go as far to say that nationalist studies attract nationalists. But there is a trend in reducing all dimension to the local level, to the national level. And they are unable, particularly unable, to see the global picture. So I've just seen a good article on nations and nationalism on the rights of just published a few days ago. of global migrants, because there will be billions of people moving from their house. Probably all children will not have a house. We will all move perennially, because if we continue this, I'm dramatizing here, of course, but there is a thing which needs to be considered as well, the fact that we are becoming ruthless. So nations are actually, like in the Pacific, like in several small islands, are redrafting their constitution, their plans, etc., to reconsider themselves as nomadic nations. And think about Bangladesh. If Bangladesh is submerged by a few meters of waters, then probably India wouldn't want the Bangladeshi population, but somebody must have the strength to welcome them. Otherwise, it will be an even more terrible genocide coming on. So, practically speaking, all these things are bringing together a lot of variables, and it's really happening. And we should follow the pattern of the earth science, because the earth science are the first, perhaps, to make a substantial effort in terms of publications and finance projects and so on, to bring together scientists, including historians in some kind, in the case I mentioned of John McNeill, or the Anthropocene Working Group. All these are moving in that direction. There is a direction like that. I am very surprised that nationalist studies, since nationalism is so central to all the problems which are living today. And Modi, you mentioned India in this incredible rhetoric that you have done this in the past, we have to do it. It looks very childish, especially in this context, and suicidal. So you have genocide in Europe, we have to do genocide in Europe. Or you had slavery, we have to reproduce slavery. It seems like there is justification for not doing the things which are required in this historical moment. So it's looking at the past to address a contingent problem which need to be addressed with new lenses and with new perspectives.
Yes, I agree that nationalism studies have been slow to take up this challenge. I think also it reflects the relative lack of economic analysis in nationalism studies, because this is at root an economic issue. Talking of economics, one of the questions that came in was asking about protectionism. And so the questioner is asking this global trend that we see now towards protectionism, tariff barriers, bringing manufacturing home, again, with a very nationalist sense of place. So the questioner is asking, could that be a good thing? Will reduction in international trade help to reduce global emissions? I guess because he or she imagines that the transport costs will be lower. So any thoughts about that? Because it was the kind of hyper-globalization of the last 20, 25 years with the shifting of manufacturing to China and India that has produced, and then the wealth that created, and the expansion of the middle classes, and the increase in consumption that Daniele was talking about, bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China and India. That's great. That's great for them, but it's disaster for the planet. So anybody want to tackle that question about whether a reduction in globalization is going to be good news for climate change or not?
My again talk is I completely agree with what you say. Protectionism might address one of the problems, which is the international travels and international commerce, and producing locally is one of the goal of any sustainable society. So it goes along with sustainability as well as with protectionism. The problem is that protectionism very often historically is being used, isolationism, for very different reasons, to reinforce industry, local industry, and therefore emit more pollution. The case of fascism is very important. I mean, if you remember, fascism invented autarky, the fact that they have to rely on their own economy and cut ties with the side world. That happens when Italy invaded Ethiopia. So when it was in the peak of expansion, a peak of Italian colonialism. These things are not casual. I think protectionism might give has a false sense of security. It might combine with a lot of sustainability goals, but if it's not done with a global perspective in mind, what I call survival cosmopolitanism in the article, I don't think it's sufficient, of course.
Yeah, and the protectionism generates that America first or my country first policies, which undermine the international cooperation, which is going to be essential to tackle climate change. So the politics of it tend to undermine the international action. So that seems to me to be the main problem.
Absolutely. I understand very well.
I was just wanted to add that I think probably the more useful discussion is to make sure that we see the full carbon footprint of everything, the whole journey of whatever product or industry we are talking about, and where the accountability is placed. So we move away from this outsourcing, of carbon emissions somewhere else, and on paper looking like nationally the emissions going down. So in this regard, I think we do see some positive developments. Well, I know it's a controversial policy once again, but in some you could see it's positive. The carbon border adjustment mechanism introduced by the European Union, where they decided to, start kind of taxing or charging or fining the industries, the polluting industries that come into the union. And this way, they try to defend themselves. They are not just outsourcing their emissions, but they're actually doing something outside of their borders. So there are different ways that we can try to move towards the genuine reduction of the global emissions and genuine national numbers, national data of the carbon emissions.
Yeah, the EU is definitely a leader in this policy sphere, but of course Europe has its own problems of economic stagnation, of the political polarization, the breakdown of the party systems. Deal better than I do, and so that kind of undermines Europe's ability to be a kind of global leader on the climate change issue. Talking of which, Rosa, I'd like to pitch a question to you about, your very interesting point about the lederhosen and the recycling bins. So there was a point, the kind of Greta Thunberg moment when it seemed like environmental consciousness was becoming deeply embedded in societies, but we seem to have lost that. So with the kind of fragmentation of the party systems and the rise of populist, the far left and far right. So what do you think went wrong, or can it be reversed, that shift?
So what we observed, paying attention to what political parties were doing, is that there was a turning point, which was basically the pandemic. After the pandemic, there was a continuous questioning of science. And after that, we see that it remained for some time, that you have these science skeptics that usually Europeans like to trust into technocratic governments and think that experts will do it better. But what we observed after the COVID-19 pandemic is that it was a turning point, in the sense that people was not trusting science anymore. That was one of the things that are not so positive. Then we see also the cost of this. So you have to understand that we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and then it starts the war in Ukraine. And this was very problematic, especially in the context of Germany, which has, of course, a lot of influence in Europe, because it affected its all energy policy. As a result of this energy policy, citizens realize that, well, one thing is that you continue with this recycling system, but it's not the same if you have to pay a lot for your heating in the winter. So there was some contestation that it was not before. So people was happy with the idea of protecting the environment, but now it was linking this into some kind of global conspiracy that it's basically against our economy, against our industry, and things like that. So the problem that I see is that now there is a clear intertwinement between ideology and all these different policies that were, step by step taking place. And at the same time, there are a lot of incentives for the parties to politicize this and make and take some profit of this. We will see this now with the new Commission and the current debates at the European Commission. And it will depend a lot on the alliances between the right and the extreme right. So again, it's not a very positive picture, the one that I'm presenting here, but we see that it's not, it's not as it was. For example, in Berlin, this idea of destroying bike lanes is also something that is taking place. So let's give more space. And in the past, it was something that we would never consider. And these are small steps towards a backsliding on all these things that were, part of the European identity, like this idea of, well, we are the champions to protect the environment and against climate. But again, as I said, there is a problem of incentives. There are many incentives to confront on this issue.
I wonder whether this, which you mentioned, if I might, Rosa, can be classified as part of the emerging phenomenon of fossil fascism. It is in case of, in Italy, the far right, farther than the right-wing government, which is actually in the government. So I'm talking about the Northern League, which is farther than the Fratelli d'Italia party, but it's very, it's very debatable who is far. They're just competing who is far. And they made a very strong campaign advertisement in which they show, let's defend the cars and the house of Italians. And then, of course, the grassroots members of these parties they oppose any environmental thing. They are completely anti-ecologist, anti-environmental. It's not just anti-climate change. They oppose everything against pollution. So the very idea that somebody at school thought, the word fossil fascist has become very popular after two terrorists started killing people. But if you read their manifesto, there is nothing ecological there. And nevertheless, a lot of academics have wrongly used the term ecofascism, which I strongly demonstrated is not usable, is not useful. But in both cases, we see a strong anti-environmental trend now in this moment. And I wonder whether this can be reverted. I don't know how this can be actually reverted. Because if there was something called ecofascism, then we would at least think, oh, well, there are the ecofascists, then when they are in power, they might do something, not destroy the bike line, increase something. But these are in power now in several countries, in Italy, of course. And they are not listening to science. They are not listening to the protesters. They are actually censorship. There is, in one case, I was personally witnessing a real act of censorship in which the mayor of Rome was in front of a burned Monte Mario, and he was trying to mention climate change, and then people started interrupting him, asking questions about immigrants, because there were immigrants in the in the mountains where they took fires, and they took all the blame. Of course, nobody thought anymore about climate change. Everybody, the public opinion was not informed sufficiently that the fire was a consequence of the drought was actually there, but they immediately thought about immigrants. And censorship is absolutely all pervasive now in Italy at the moment. So you have different dimensions in which you can talk about ecofascism, of course, fossil fascism, and it's not. It needs to be studied more carefully, and I think there is a lot of research going on at the moment. Again, I invite people to publish in this. It will be very interesting.
Great.
Yeah, and
we are getting towards the end of our allotted time, so I would invite people, if you have any concluding thoughts, we can go around the room and summarize for our viewers. Marianna, do you want to kick off?
Just a very final thought is, of course, we're now watching what's going on in Baku, Azerbaijan. So as you mentioned, the staff fossil exporting authoritarian countries hosting. It's at least third year in a row we have similar profile of the host country, which is in charge of the major climate change negotiations. And I think it's very interesting to see how much of this national versus global discourse transpire throughout the negotiations. And even though there are not much hopes or expectations from this particular COP, everybody is waiting for the next year when it's going to be in Brazil. But still, it would be interesting to see what we will be able to achieve at the end. I mean, the start was already quite exciting with the president of Azerbaijan saying that gas and oil it gives for. It was a controversial beginning of these negotiations, but we will see what will be at the end of it and how much of the impact of the political regime of the hosting country will have on the outcome.
Rosa?
Well, so just let me remark that I am very grateful for being invited to this very interesting panel. I think that future research will have to focus on what Daniele was just mentioning, this fossil fascism, because it's something that unfortunately we will see a lot. And something that we are planning to study in the future is the idea of the backsliding of this climate policy. So one of the things that we want to see is that, well, is it beneficial, electorally beneficial to parties to dismantle climate protection? And I think that it will depend, the future will depend a lot of this. So if citizens are aware of the danger of climate change, and if they, if accountability works, and parties do not see this idea that I was mentioning before, this idea of the incentives that they have to politicize on this issue and to act against climate protection, maybe we can see something like that. But we are unfortunately in a moment in which the future will be studying backsliding on these policies. So we are expectant to see the evolution.
Great, thank you. And on to Daniele.
Yeah, I think it's backsliding is a good definition in this case, a good term to use. I think definitely one of the trends which I'm trying at least to promote is to research on this, on the fact that not only the far right is representing not the nation, but vested interests, because they are not representing the nation, actually. They are nationalists, but in fact, they are representing a small selection of the population, a tiny super minority. That's also the fact that these groups are not interested in their future generation, and I think what is going on can be defined as a form of injustice which has never occurred in any part of the world, in any part of history. It is probably the greatest injustice which we are beginning to experience. It is not just our generation, the previous generation, let's say our generation, or the one who are today is our 30s and 40s, are actually polluting the world to death for their children. It's also that the first victims of this climate change, but only the first one, seems to be people who have not done any harms to the planet. So people who have simply gone on with their daily lives, like in Somalia. Nobody talks about internal refugees. Most climate refugees are internal because they do not have the resources to move to far away. They go into the big city. There is an enormous urbanization process in cities like Nairobi and other cities like Mogadishu in Somalia, etc. They are accumulating there without very quickly because they have nowhere to go. So climate migration is at the moment happening at the local level within states, but certainly if it starts coming way, and of course there are actually very important things to consider. We are not going to stay here for a long time. We are, if we continue this model, the next migrant will be us. Indeed, there are a couple of books which have been novels, actually, not books, not science, not like an Italian one was called by Bruno Arpaia. Was a very important, very significant book about Italians escaping from Italy because climate change was destroying everything, their livelihood, and they tried to go north, and the north they went, the more barrier they found. So when they go to Scandinavia, nobody wants them. And it was a really interesting way of empathizing, thinking in terms of what is really happening to a lot of people, millions of people around the world already, and there will be billions probably in the near future. So it's not just Venice, which is going under the water. There are a lot of other things which are accompanying the current change. So I don't want to be too, again, to sound too pessimistic, but I wanted to raise the alarm bell that, I mean, science is moving, and nobody's listening, not even the social sciences. And I'm actually the son of a physicist, and so I'm born within a scientific family, and also my mother was an artist, by the way. So we have both in the family, and I think the most important thing at the moment is for us is to bring disciplines together, but generally for people would be to contact nature. I mean, we have lost contact with nature, so we are not aware of the suffering of nature, and this is probably going away from our topic, but I'm just trying to give some positive notes if in this cataclysmic scenario, which is very difficult to find. So let's go back to nature in some way. I mean, go walk. I mean, personally, I don't travel by train. I'm very happy this is organized by video conference. I don't travel by plane. I don't have a car. I don't watch television, but Peter is also agreeing. Perhaps when BBC News is there, I to go through the internet. But generally, I think a lot of people can do something at the personal level, and that's will help to bring a coherent, less depressing atmosphere. Because I mean, if you do what you preach, it brings, of course, some extra consciousness, which helps to tackle difficult moments and difficult challenge, like what we've seen recently in global politics. So these are personal observations, so you might feel free to ignore them.
Thank you for pulling it together and giving us a kind of rousing vision. So in conclusion, I'll make a couple of announcements on behalf of the Association for Study of Nationalities, which is that The next panel in the virtual ASN will be on Wednesday, December the 4th, and it will be on education and nationalism. That's on a Wednesday, not a Thursday. And the ASN annual convention will be taking place at Columbia University in person, May 22nd to 24th next year. And the call for papers is out. I think the deadline is 12th of December. So I'd encourage viewers to think about submitting a paper or panel proposal, and then we can, if Daniele doesn't mind us getting on trains and planes, we can, some of us at least, can meet in person in Columbia and take things from there. So thank you to the three colleagues for terrifically informative. I learned so much from this discussion, and I realize there's a lot more that we all need to learn. So
okay, so shall we close it here?
Yes, that's us done.
I don't know how many people are listening now at the moment. I don't have the... Okay, thank you very much, Peter. That was fantastic, great. I hope it will bring more research forward. It will help to conduct more integrated research.
And if you if you go to your email, there's a debrief session which we can log on to separately. So I'll sign off here and then sign in.
Yes, thank you very much.
So thank you to all participants. Bye-bye.